Hello, Symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, Religious Studies PhD and University Lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. So, is witchcraft forbidden in Christianity? Is it antithetical to Christian faith? Can Christians practice esotericism, magic practices, witchcraft? Are the two incompatible? What's the matter with it? You could think that the relationship between Christianity and witchcraft is more straightforward, as in Christianity just forbids it outright. But as we will see today, because we will cover the whole history of the relationship between Christianity and witchcraft, things are a bit more nuanced and complex than that. So buckle up. It's going to be a long one, so grab a snack and a drink. And also, before we start, I'd like to remind you that this project of delivering free academic scholarship based on peer-reviewed sources can only exist thanks to your support. This project is brought to you by you, so please consider supporting my work with donations on PayPal, joining my fantastic community, my inner symposium on Patreon, which gives you also lots of perks depending on your chosen tier, or you can support me on Coffee, super thanking me in the chat, and checking out my services at drangelapuca.com. Many of you guys reach out to me saying that you would like to explore a bit more a certain topic or another. Well, you've got the opportunity to do that if you book a tutoring session on my website. So check it out, please. And now I'd say let's crack on with our topic for today, which is quite exciting, the history of Christianity and witchcraft. So let's start. So indeed, today we are going to explore the relationship, the historical relationship between Christianity and witchcraft, or what we may also call magic practices. In addressing this subject, it is essential first to clarify what we mean by witch and witchcraft in the context of Christian doctrine, as these themes carry diverse meanings across time and place, shaped by cultural, religious, and even political forces. In its broadest sense, witchcraft refers to practices believed to harness supernatural forces, often through spells, charms, or rituals, to achieve particular outcomes in the physical world. A witch, therefore, was typically seen as a person who had acquired or was believed to have acquired secret knowledge or powers that allowed them to exert influence beyond ordinary human capabilities. In this historical overview that we will do today, witchcraft is a term often used to describe any act deemed magical, though what was seen as magical could differ significantly depending on religious and cultural interpretations. Within Christianity, the term witchcraft was largely associated with practices thought to be in opposition to the Christian faith, particularly where these practices sought power or knowledge outside divine grace. This perception was deeply rooted in the Christian cosmology that positioned God as the ultimate source of authority, with supernatural acts reserved strictly for the divine or divinely appointed agents, such as saints or clergy. From this perspective, any attempt to yield power that seemed to rival or bypass God's authority was viewed with suspicion and frequently condemned as demonic or influenced by evil. However, as we will see, this relationship is far from straightforward, as Christianity itself has absorbed, redefined, and at times accommodated practices that could be seen as magical. So let's trace the evolving Christian responses to witchcraft from the early church to the modern period, examining how Christianity's engagement with magic has ranged from outright condemnation to ambivalence and, in some cases, synthesis with local traditions and ceremonial practices. To understand the early Christian stance on witchcraft and magic, it is essential to consider the religious, cultural, and theological underpinnings that shaped Christian responses to supernatural practices. Christianity emerged within a Greco-Roman world already rife with magical beliefs and practices, from divination and astrology to the use of amulets and charms. Early Christians, however, positioned themselves as distinct from these practices by emphasizing monotheistic devotion to God, viewing any unauthorized attempt to access supernatural power as a violation of divine order. This perspective draws heavily on both Hebrew scriptures and early Christian writings, where magic is cast not only as spiritually dangerous, but as a rejection of God's exclusive authority over the universe. In the Hebrew Bible, magic and divination are consistently associated with non-Israelite peoples and considered abominations that conflict with monotheistic worship. One of the most direct prohibitions occurs in Deuteronomy 18:10-12, which states, "No one shall be found among you who practices divination, or is a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or who consults ghosts or spirits, or who seeks oracles from the dead." These verses underscore a theological commitment to exclusivity in worship and an emphasis on the dangers of external influences. The concern was not solely with the practices themselves, but with the worldview they represented, a cosmology that allowed humans to yield supernatural power independently of Yahweh. This aligns with the cultural milieu of the ancient Near East, where sorcery and divination were often closely linked to polytheistic religions and foreign deities, which were seen as spiritual rivals to Yahweh. In the New Testament, the condemnation of magic is continued, often with an emphasis on the incompatibility of magic with the gospel message. For example, in the Acts of the Apostles, Simon Magus, a Samaritan who practices sorcery, attempts to buy the Holy Spirit's power from the apostles, only to be harshly rebuked. This story of Simon Magus serves as an important early Christian narrative about the corrupting influence of attempting to purchase spiritual power. Simon's attempt reflects what would become a core Christian belief, that divine gifts and spiritual power are not commodities, nor are they accessible by human means alone. The apostles' rejection of Simon establishes a clear boundary between legitimate spiritual power bestowed by God and unauthorized supernatural power, which is suspect and ultimately unauthentic. This narrative was influential in shaping the Church's view of magic as a form of impiety and a potential affront to divine sovereignty. Beyond Scripture, the early Church Fathers provided theological frameworks that reinforced anti-magical sentiments, equating magic to idolatry, deception, and demonic influence. Figures such as Tertullian, Augustine, and Chrysostom addressed magic as a serious threat to Christian purity and salvation. Tertullian, one of the earliest Christian apologists, argued that even benign seeming practices like astrology were fundamentally opposed to the Christian faith, as they implied a deterministic universe incompatible with the Christian's God sovereignty and the concept of free will. In On Idolatry, Tertullian specifically warned against astrology and divination, seeing them as gateways to idolatry and pagan belief systems that contradicted Christian teachings. Augustine's contributions to this discourse were profound and enduring. In De Doctrina Christiana, he took a definitive stance that all forms of magic, regardless of intent, were inherently demonic. Augustine saw magic as a means by which individuals sought forbidden knowledge or power, thereby aligning themselves with demonic forces in opposition to God's will. Augustine argued that even when magical acts seemed harmless or aimed to heal, they remained corrupt as they involved appeal to unknown spirits outside God's ordained hierarchy. For Augustine, the use of magical incantations, charms, or spells implied a lack of trust in divine providence, casting magic as a direct challenge to God's authority. This line of thought set a precedent within Christian theology that would persist for centuries, associating all magical acts with idolatry and rebellion against God. John Chrysostom, an influential theologian in the Eastern Church, likewise preached against magic, especially focusing on its appeal among common believers. In his sermons, Chrysostom admonished Christians who resorted to amulets, charms, and fortune-telling, which he argued betrayed a lack of faith in God. Chrysostom's approach reflects a pastoral concern, as he recognized that magical practices were widespread in the popular culture of his time, and that simply condemning them might not be effective. Instead, he sought to educate his followers on the dangers of these practices, portraying them as sinful and spiritually corrosive. These early condemnations of magic are not merely reactions to individual acts, they are part of a broader Christian worldview that fundamentally opposes any supernatural authority outside God. In the teachings of the Church Fathers, we see the construction of a dualistic cosmology, where supernatural phenomena must either be divine or demonic. This binary thinking laid the groundwork for the more aggressive persecution of magic in the medieval and early modern periods, where even benign practices could be interpreted as spiritual treason. A particularly illuminating example of early Christian attitudes towards witchcraft can be found in the Canon Episcopi, a text from the 10th century that reflects ecclesiastical views on popular beliefs about witchcraft. The Canon criticizes those who believe that women can transform into animals or fly at night, suggesting instead that these beliefs are mere illusions propagated by the devil. The Canon Episcopi warns that belief in the reality of witchcraft, particularly the nocturnal flights of women, is itself heretical, as it constitutes a form of faith in pagan superstition rather than in the Christian God. What makes the Canon Episcopi notable is its ambivalence. While it categorically denounces belief in witchcraft, it treats the phenomenon as a psychological or demonic illusion rather than a real threat. This ambivalence reveals the Church's pragmatic approach during the early medieval period, as outright persecution of supposed witches was uncommon. Instead, the Church sought to correct what it saw as erroneous beliefs among rural populations, thereby minimizing the supernatural threat while asserting doctrinal authority over popular folk practices. The Canon Episcopi thus illustrates an early form of the Church's strategy. Rather than directly confronting every instance of magic, it often opted to reinterpret and delegitimize these practices, framing them as deceptions rather than authentic supernatural acts. So, early Christian condemnations of magic and witchcraft were shaped by both scriptural precedent and the teachings of influential theologians, from the Old and New Testament prohibitions to the doctrinal writings of church fathers. From the Old and New Testament prohibitions to the doctrinal writings of church fathers, early Christianity established a framework that viewed magic as antithetical to faith. The Canon Episcopi further demonstrates that while the Church rejected belief in witchcraft, it was not yet committed to widespread persecution, instead seeking to redefine supernatural beliefs as delusions or errors. This groundwork would later evolve, influencing how medieval and early modern Christians approached and regulated magic practices within their communities. As we move into the medieval period, Christian attitudes towards witchcraft and magic began to develop a more nuanced framework. Influenced by the philosophical and theological developments of the time, Christian scholars started to distinguish between types of magic based on intent and perceived source of power. This categorization, often simplified as the distinction between white and black magic, marked a significant shift in how the Church interpreted and responded to magical practices. While black magic was uniformly condemned as heretical and linked to demonic forces, white magic, or what some refer to as natural magic, was occasionally tolerated, provided it was seen as operating within the divine order rather than against it. The development of Scholasticism in medieval Europe significantly influenced Christian perceptions of magic. Scholasticism, a method of critical thought rooted in the works of Aristotle, sought to reconcile reason with Christian theology. Scholars such as Thomas Aquinas applied Aristotelian principles to explore questions of causality and natural law, allowing for a nuanced perspective on certain magical practices. Aquinas distinguished between miraculous acts, which were divine interventions beyond natural law, and natural magic, which he viewed as a legitimate manipulation of natural forces without invoking supernatural beings. Aquinas articulated these distinctions in his Summa Theologica, where he condemned demonic magic as a form of heresy while allowing for practices that used natural properties in accordance with God's creation. For instance, he argued that medicinal herbs could be used for healing as this aligned with natural causality established by God, whereas necromancy, or summoning spirits, was unequivocally heretical, as it sought supernatural aid outside God's authority. This acceptance of certain natural or white magical practices marked an important development. It provided a theoretical basis for some magic to be deemed acceptable within a Christian framework, provided it was rooted in the understanding of God's natural order. During the High Middle Ages, the Church's stance on magic began to crystallize in official documents, including canon law and papal decrees. Church authorities became increasingly concerned with regulating and codifying magic to prevent heretical or demonic practices. The distinction between white and black magic became particularly significant in canon law, where attempts were made to differentiate between practices viewed as benign, such as certain types of healing and protective spells, and those believed to involve demonic invocation. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX established the Papal Inquisition to investigate heretical practices, which would later extend its reach to include various forms of forbidden magic. The papal bull Super Illius Specula, issued by Pope John the 22nd in 1326, explicitly condemned necromancy and associated practices. John the 22nd was deeply concerned about magic and sorcery, which he believed could threaten his own life and the stability of Christian society. His bull extended the Church's investigative authority, allowing inquisitors to target individuals accused of employing sorcery and black magic, marking an important escalation in the Church's efforts to control magical practices. Despite these measures, local tolerance for certain practices persisted. In rural areas, cunning folk or local healers continued to practice forms of magic that drew on Christian iconography, such as invoking saints or using prayers for protection. Although these practices were not formally endorsed by the Church, they were often tolerated because they operated within a Christian framework and served practical community-based needs. This demonstrates that while the Church condemned demonic or heretical magic, it maintained a complex and at times ambivalent stance toward folk magical practices that blended seamlessly with Christian ritual. The increasing influence of Scholasticism in the 13th century allowed for the concept of natural magic to gain traction among Christian scholars. Natural magic was defined as the use of natural forces or properties believed to be part of God's creation. This was distinct from supernatural magic, which sought power from sources outside God's dominion, often interpreted as demonic. Albertus Magnus, a Dominican friar and philosopher, was one of the key proponents of natural magic. In his writings, Albertus suggested that certain magical operations, such as manipulating herbs or gemstones for their inherent properties, could be performed without invoking demonic spirits, provided they were aligned with God's created order. His work laid the foundation for later Renaissance thinkers to explore magic within a Christian framework, and for alchemy and astrology to be pursued as sciences grounded in the natural world. This reclassification of certain magical practices as natural had a significant impact on later Christian approaches to science and esoteric knowledge. It permitted some forms of magic to be perceived not as direct challenges to the Church, but as means of studying and manipulating the world in ways that were compatible with Christian theology. This toleration, however, was contingent on the practitioner's intent and the perceived alignment with God's natural order. Any hint of summoning spirits or invoking supernatural beings outside this framework was still considered heretical and subject to severe punishment. While distinctions between licit and illicit magic provided some latitude, fears about magic and heresy intensified as the late medieval period progressed. By the 14th century, Europe was facing upheavals from the Black Death, political conflicts, and economic hardship. These events fostered social anxiety, with the Church increasingly viewing heresy and witchcraft as sources of disorder and a threat to ecclesiastical authority. Magic that once might have been tolerated as natural or benign was now more frequently linked to heresy, as fears grew that witches and heretics were conspiring against Christian society. This period saw a shift towards a more rigid condemnation of magical practices, and demonology, an intellectual framework that classified supernatural forces as either angelic or demonic, began to dominate theological discussions. Scholastic theologians like Nicholas Emmerich and inquisitors such as Bernard Guy reinforced the belief that any magical act was potentially linked to demonic forces, even those practices once classified as natural magic. This growing association between magic and diabolism laid the foundation for the widespread witch trials that would emerge in the early modern period, as church and secular authorities increasingly conflated witchcraft with devil worship. In the early modern period, the Church's approach to witchcraft and magic intensified dramatically, culminating in widespread witch hunts across Europe and the Americas. This period, roughly spanning the 15th to the 17th centuries, saw an unprecedented level of persecution, with thousands of individuals accused of witchcraft and subjected to trial, imprisonment, and execution. This shift was driven by a complex interplay of theological, social, and political factors, most notably the rise of demonology, which framed witchcraft as a heretical pact with the devil. Demonology provided a theological justification for witch hunts, as it redefined magic not merely as superstition or a breach of Christian norms, but as a direct alliance with malevolent supernatural forces. One of the most influential texts in the rise of early modern witch hunts was the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, written in 1487 by Hendrik Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor, with contributions from his colleague Jakob Spranger. The Malleus Maleficarum synthesized previous Christian condemnations of witchcraft and demonology into a single accessible manual that outlined the nature of witchcraft, methods of identifying witches, and procedural guidelines for their persecution. Kramer and Spranger's work was pivotal because it positioned witchcraft as both heresy and a crime against the social and moral order. The authors argued that witches were in league with the devil, that they engaged in explicit pacts with demonic beings, and that their actions posed a grave threat to Christian society. They asserted that women, particularly, were susceptible to witchcraft due to their supposed moral and intellectual weaknesses, a viewpoint rooted in prevailing medieval misogyny, which further fueled the gendered aspect of the witch hunts. The Malleus Maleficarum categorizes witches' abilities as inherently malevolent, including causing illness, destroying crops, and engaging in acts of sacrilege. By connecting witchcraft to satanic influence, the text justified the use of extreme measures, including torture, to extract confessions from accused individuals. Despite its controversial reception and criticism from some quarters of the Church, the Malleus Maleficarum became widely circulated and was used by both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. It served as a basis for witch trials across Europe, cementing the belief that witchcraft was not merely superstition but a form of organized, diabolical conspiracy. The rise of demonology in early modern Europe played a crucial role in transforming attitudes towards witchcraft. Influential demonologists such as Jean Baudin and Martin del Rio expanded upon earlier theological ideas, creating an intellectual framework that categorized all forms of magic as potentially demonic. Demonology proposed that supernatural forces existed within a binary hierarchy. On one side, angels and God, and on the other side, demons and the devil. This dualistic system left no room for benign supernatural acts outside of the divine realm. Any attempt to access supernatural power was therefore implicitly suspect. Jean Bodin, a French jurist and influential demonologist, argued that witches posed an existential threat to society because they undermined the divine order. In his De la démonomanie des sorcières, on the demon mania of witches, published in 1580, Bodin warned that witches had the ability to commune with demons, perform maleficium, evil deeds, and threaten the moral fabric of Christian communities. Bodin's work reinforced the idea that witchcraft was not merely a personal failing, but a form of rebellion against divine authority, equating witchcraft with treason. This conception allowed secular authorities to join ecclesiastical courts in prosecuting witches, as the crime was seen as a threat not only to the church but to the stability of the state. Martin del Rio, born in Antwerp in what is now Belgium, was a Jesuit and a theologian who authored Disquisitionum Magicarum, Investigations into Magic, in the early 17th century, and further developed the demonological framework. Del Rio's work went beyond classifying types of magic. It also provided detailed guidance for identifying and interrogating witches. He proposed methods for discerning signs of demonic influence and argued that those practicing witchcraft were effectively servants of Satan, complicit in a cosmic battle between good and evil. By codifying these ideas, demonologists like Del Rio contributed to the intellectual justification for witch hunts, supporting the view that witches, as agents of the devil, could be lawfully persecuted and punished to protect society. The religious upheavals of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation further intensified the persecution of witches, as Protestant and Catholic factions vied for dominance in Europe. Both sides emphasized doctrinal purity and moral reform, often scapegoating suspected witches as symbols of religious and social deviance. In Protestant regions, accusations of witchcraft became intertwined with fears of heresy and idolatry, with reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin denouncing witches as agents of Satan. Calvin, in particular, asserted that witches were engaged in a direct rebellion against God, aligning himself with the demonological view that witchcraft constituted a pact with the devil. Similarly, the Catholic Counter-Reformation reinforced anti-witchcraft sentiment. Catholic authorities sought to reaffirm the Church's moral authority by intensifying campaigns against any perceived threat to orthodoxy, including witchcraft. The Council of Trent, while not directly addressing witchcraft, helped to standardize doctrine and bolster ecclesiastical discipline, indirectly supporting efforts to root out heretical practices. As part of its campaign for moral and doctrinal purity, the Counter-Reformation Church increasingly used witch hunts as a means of asserting control over local populations and suppressing false practices deemed incompatible with Orthodox Christianity. The intensity of witch hunts varied widely across Europe, with some regions witnessing far more persecutions than others. Germany, in particular, became a center for some of the most notorious witch trials, exemplified by the Würzburg and Bamberg trials of the 1620s. These trials, driven by local authorities with both secular and religious motivations, targeted hundreds of individuals, including prominent citizens, clergy, and even children. The Würzburg trials, presided over by Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf Ehrenberg, saw nearly 900 people executed, with accusations extending to allegations of pacts with the devil, attendance at Sabbaths, and maleficent magic. The Bamberg trials, similarly brutal, were marked by the widespread use of torture to extract confessions and implicated entire families. Both trials exemplify the extent to which demonological beliefs and socio-political pressures could drive localized witch hunts to catastrophic levels. These cases also highlight how the early modern witch hunts were not merely about religious purity, but were influenced by economic, political, and personal conflicts, with witchcraft accusations often targeting vulnerable or marginalized members of society. By the late 17th century, the witch hunts began to wane, influenced by changing intellectual currents and a growing skepticism towards supernatural explanations. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and empirical evidence led to a questioning of the validity of witchcraft accusations, while judicial reforms gradually reduced the use of torture and improved standards of evidence in trials. In Britain, for example, the Witchcraft Act of 1736 marked a shift away from treating witchcraft as a crime of heresy, reclassifying it as a form of fraud or superstition. This transition mirrored broader social changes as Enlightenment thinkers increasingly argued that witchcraft was a relic of ignorance rather than a real threat to society. In this context, the legacy of the early modern witch hunts is complex. While they were a product of their time, influenced by theological, social, and political factors, the memory of these persecutions continued to shape cultural attitudes towards magic and superstition. The fear of witchcraft as a pervasive organized conspiracy left a lasting mark on European society, influencing both secular and religious policies long after the intensity of the hunts had subsided. While Christianity's official stance on magic was largely prohibitive, the early modern period also saw the emergence of ceremonial magic traditions that blended Christian symbolism with esoteric practices. These traditions include Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and later orders such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which represent a different approach to magic within a Christianized framework. Rather than openly opposing Christianity, these traditions sought to integrate aspects of Christian mysticism, symbolism, and theology, presenting their practices as compatible with and even enhancing Christian faith. We will now examine how these traditions reconciled Christian elements with their magical practices and how they navigated a complex relationship with mainstream religious institutions. But first, I'd like to remind you that I'm going to have a Magus Lecture, which is a monthly lecture that I have every month with all my Magus or higher tier patrons. And this month is going to be more specifically, as you can see, on the Christian influence on pagan and esoteric practices. So if you're interested, we're going to have this lecture on November the 17th at 4 p.m. GMT or UK time. If you cannot attend live, you will still have the opportunity to watch the recording and also to access a database of over 60 Magus lectures at this point. So every month we have one. So I hope that you can join. It will also help support this project and it will allow you to access my fantastic and growing inner symposium community. We have lots of fun together and there's book club, a Discord server. We also have a monthly call for all patrons of all tiers. So I really hope you consider. Back to our topic. Rosicrucianism emerged in the early 17th century with the publication of the Fama Fraternitatis in 1614 and Confessio Fraternitatis in 1615. These manifestos announced the existence of a secret society of Rosicrucians who possessed esoteric wisdom and sought to reform society by spreading spiritual enlightenment. The Rosicrucian movement framed itself within a Christian context, portraying its practices as a higher, hidden knowledge accessible through divine revelation rather than in opposition to Christian doctrine. Rosicrucian texts utilized Christian allegories and referenced biblical figures, positioning their esoteric wisdom as part of a quest for divine knowledge. For instance, the Fama Fraternitatis describes Christian Rosenkreuz, the legendary founder of the Rosicrucian order, as a pious Christian who studied alchemy, Kabbalah, and mystical texts to understand God's creation more deeply. In Rosicrucian thought, magic was not a means to circumvent divine authority, but a method for uncovering spiritual truths that ultimately reinforced the Christian worldview. The Rosicrucians saw themselves as inheritors of divine wisdom, aligning their practices with the pursuit of salvation and Christian virtue. The Rosicrucian approach to magic reflects an attempt to align esoteric knowledge with Christianity by depicting it as a form of Christian mysticism. This syncretic approach allowed practitioners to engage in magical or alchemical studies without overtly challenging the theological boundaries set by the Church. While there is no historical evidence that a formal Rosicrucian order existed in this period, the ideas and imagery in Rosicrucian literature inspired a range of esoteric groups, laying the groundwork for later occult movements in Europe. Freemasonry, another influential ceremonial tradition, emerged in the 17th century, evolving from medieval guilds of stonemasons into a fraternity with a complex system of rituals and symbols. Freemasonry was not explicitly magical in the sense of manipulating supernatural forces. Instead, it focused on moral philosophy, personal development, and spiritual symbolism. However, Freemasonry's rituals and teachings incorporated Christian symbols, prayers, and references to biblical figures such as Solomon, drawing on Christian themes to illustrate ethical lessons. Freemasonry's adaptation of Christian elements served several purposes. First, it allowed Freemasons to present their fraternity as compatible with Christian values, distancing themselves from accusations of heresy or Satanism that were commonly leveled against other esoteric movements. By incorporating Christian iconography and invoking the divine in their rituals, Freemasonry could align itself with the moral and social values of the time, avoiding the suspicion directed at other forms of esotericism. Freemasonry's symbols, such as the square, compass, and all-seeing eye, were often interpreted as representations of divine order, harmony, and enlightenment, reinforcing its alignment with Christian cosmology without engaging in explicitly supernatural practices. Additionally, Freemasonry's structure of degrees, each with progressively deeper layers of symbolism and meaning, echoed the initiatory and transformative aspects found in mystical Christianity. Although Freemasonry does not align itself strictly with any one religion, its framework has allowed Christian ideas to permeate its teachings, creating a form of spiritual practice that incorporates moral philosophy with esoteric ritual. The Hermetic tradition, drawing from ancient Greco-Egyptian writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, found renewed interest during the Renaissance and continued to influence ceremonial magic in the early modern period. Hermeticism offered a philosophical system that explored the nature of the divine, the cosmos, and humanity's place within it. Alchemical texts rooted in Hermetic principles were often framed as Christian allegories, presenting the transformation of base metals into gold as a metaphor for spiritual purification and divine union. Many Christian alchemists viewed alchemical work as a process of imitating God's creative act, believing that the physical transformation achieved through alchemy mirrored spiritual transformation. The goal of the alchemist, therefore, was not only material but spiritual, to purify oneself and attain a closer relationship with God. Figures like Paracelsus exemplified this synthesis by grounding their medical and alchemical theories in both Christian doctrine and Hermetic teachings, seeking to harmonize their practices with Christian values. This fusion of alchemical and Christian thought allowed practitioners to explore esoteric sciences under the guise of religious and philosophical study, thus evading the stigma of practicing magic as it was typically understood by church authorities. These ceremonial magic traditions found ways to navigate the theological tension between Christianity and esoteric practices by framing their work as compatible with or even enhancing Christian faith. By grounding their rituals, symbols, and objectives within a Christian framework, these traditions argued that their pursuit of knowledge, moral improvement, and spiritual enlightenment was ultimately aligned with the goals of Christianity. Rather than challenging Christian doctrine, they presented magic as a means of understanding divine mysteries and attaining personal virtue. This approach allowed practitioners to explore esoteric knowledge without directly contradicting Christian teachings, enabling a form of magical practice that avoided the charges of heresy or witchcraft commonly associated with folk magic. However, the tension between mainstream Christianity and these traditions persisted. Freemasonry, for example, was viewed with suspicion by both Catholic and Protestant authorities in later centuries, as were certain occult societies that emerged from Rosicrucian and Hermetic traditions. This ambivalence highlights the complexity of integrating Christian influences with esoteric pursuits in a period where boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy were closely guarded. Now, let's cover the influence of Christianity on contemporary paganism. The influence of Christian ceremonial magic and folk practices on contemporary paganism is an important aspect of the current landscape of modern spiritualities. While early pagan revival movements of the 20th century often sought to reclaim pre-Christian traditions, they also integrated frameworks and rituals inherited from ceremonial magic traditions, which themselves drew on Christian and Judeo-Christian symbolism. This blending of influences reflects how historical interactions between Christianity and esoteric traditions continue to shape the way in which modern pagans engage with both magic and spirituality. In the early 20th century, the revival of pagan traditions gained momentum, with figures like Gerald Gardner, Doreen Valiente, and other foundational thinkers of Wicca and modern paganism establishing new forms of religious and magical practice. Gardnerian Wicca, one of the most influential branches of modern paganism, shows clear traces of Christian ceremonial magic traditions, particularly the structures and rites borrowed from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the broader Western esoteric tradition. The Golden Dawn, established in the late 19th century, had a significant influence on the ritual structure of Wicca and other pagan paths. The Golden Dawn's system of invoking the elements, casting a sacred circle, and conducting formalized invocations drew upon Christian and Kabbalistic symbolism. This influence is visible in Gardnerian Wicca's adaptations of rituals like circle casting, calling the quarters, and using consecrated objects such as the atames and chalices, which mimic ceremonial traditions designed to consecrate space and summon divine presence. Furthermore, elements such as the pentacle and the ritual phrases adapted from ceremonial traditions continue to link contemporary paganism with older Christianized forms of ceremonial magic. In Wicca, for example, the ritualistic invocation of the four elements can be traced to both Hermetic and Kabbalistic systems, which often included Christian invocations to saints or archangels. By integrating these elements, contemporary paganism selectively draws from Christian-influenced ceremonial traditions while repositioning these practices within a polytheistic or animistic worldview. Beyond ceremonial magic, folk Christianity has also indirectly influenced contemporary pagan practices through rural costumes, traditional healing practices, folklore, and rituals that persisted in Europe's rural areas. Many of these customs involved practices that are now reinterpreted within a pagan framework, such as charms, herbal remedies, and seasonal celebrations, some of which were originally Christianized adaptations of earlier folk beliefs. The integration of Christianized folk practices is particularly evident in traditions surrounding the agricultural calendar. Celebrations like May Day and Lammas, which were retained in Christian festival calendars but had pagan roots, have been reincorporated into modern pagan Sabbaths as part of the wheel of the year. These seasonal festivals, now celebrated in pagan context, demonstrate how Christianized folk customs were re-paganized in contemporary spirituality, reclaiming their pre-Christian heritage while maintaining forms familiar to European agrarian communities. Moreover, Christian folk practices surrounding healing and protective charms have been adapted into pagan spellcraft and herbalism. The practice of invoking blessings or saints for health and protection, while once overtly Christian, have been transformed into generalized protective rituals within paganism. For example, the use of charms or amulets that invoke nature spirits or the gods of old has parallels in folk Christianity, where saints were invoked for specific purposes. By reclaiming these practices, modern pagans effectively recontextualize Christianized folk traditions as part of a polytheistic or animistic system. In the present day, the relationship between paganism and Christianity is complex and varied, reflecting both tensions and areas of convergence. Modern paganism, particularly in its focus on nature, polytheism, and magic, presents a worldview that is often seen as fundamentally different from Christianity. This divergence can lead to challenges as paganism's polytheistic beliefs and practices often stand in contrast to Christianity's monotheistic doctrine. For some Christians, especially those adhering to more conservative or evangelical beliefs, modern pagan practices are viewed with suspicion or opposition, sometimes equated with witchcraft or idolatry. However, there is also a growing movement toward interfaith dialogue and mutual respect. Many contemporary pagans, especially those involved in environmental activism, find common grounds with Christians who emphasize stewardship of the earth and ecological responsibility. Shared concerns over environmental issues have allowed some pagan and Christian groups to collaborate on conservation projects, demonstrating that while their theological perspectives may differ, they can work together on practical issues. This shift towards interfaith cooperation represents a recent development in pagan-Christian relations, reflecting broader societal trends towards inclusivity and mutual respect. In addition, the emergence of Christo-paganism, a syncretic practice combining elements of paganism and Christianity, illustrates a new approach to spirituality that bridges both traditions. Christo-pagans often incorporate Christian symbols and beliefs into pagan rituals, or vice versa, creating an eclectic spirituality that draws from both paths. This hybrid approach reflects the adaptability and fluidity of contemporary spirituality, as individuals seek to reconcile personal faith with diverse religious influences. Christo-paganism highlights a growing interest in personal spiritual synthesis, showing that while traditional boundaries between Christianity and paganism remain, some individuals are finding innovative ways to integrate both. So, to conclude, the influence of Christianity on contemporary esotericism and paganism, whether through ceremonial magic, folk practices, or the evolving relationship between the two traditions, underscores a complex heritage of adaptation, reinterpretation, and resilience. While contemporary pagans and magic practitioners often seek to reclaim a pre-Christian heritage, the enduring impact of Christian elements within esoteric practices reveals the layered nature of modern pagan spirituality and also the permeable nature of religions more generally. The reappropriation of Christianized symbols, rituals, and festivals demonstrates that paganism has not developed in isolation, and no religion really does, but rather as part of a centuries-old interaction with Christianity. This dynamic interplay continues to shape modern esotericisms and paganism's evolving identities and relationship with Christianity, illustrating that while these traditions may appear oppositional, and perhaps theologically they are, they also have profoundly influenced one another in the formation of contemporary spirituality. This is it for today's episode. Wow, that was a long one. So if you watched until this point, leave me a cross emoji, I suppose. And if you have, wow, you are super committed to your learning and knowledge. So that's fantastic of you. And yeah, if you like this video, please share it around. Help me reach the 100K mark on my YouTube channel. So please share my video around. And also, if you like my project of delivering free academic knowledge based on peer-reviewed scholarship, I would really, really appreciate it if you consider supporting my work with donations on PayPal, joining my Patreon community, my coffee, super thanking me in the comments, or checking out my services at drangelapuka.com. Also, don't forget to sign up for my newsletter because you get all my uncensored thoughts and images and what I'm up to, and you don't have to rely on capricious social media algorithms to know what I've been up to. So please sign up for my newsletter. It's on my website as well. And you find the links for everything everywhere on screen in the comments. So I'd really appreciate it if you consider. If you like this video, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and help others subscribe to the channel as well. And share this video again, really highlighting that point. And also activate the notification bell so that you will never miss a new upload from me. And I hope that you stay tuned because this has been a fantastic journey of knowledge on all things esoteric that will continue, hopefully. So I hope that you stay tuned, and thank you for being here. And yeah, there's lots of academic fun ahead. So I'll see you next time. Bye for now.